San Francisco, November 11th, 1918. The end of the war to end all wars. Our boys had come home with the victory parade down Market Street, and the city looked forward to an era of peace and prosperity. Welcome to the Roaring 20s. The 20s, when hemlines got higher, morals got lower, and the party never stopped. At least that's the way we usually remember America's wildest decade. But beneath the carefree facade, the 20s were a complex, even contradictory time. A mixture of innocence and decadence, brilliance and brutality. And nowhere were these extremes any more in evidence than San Francisco. In the 1920s, as always, the city marched to its own beat. Rambunctious, flamboyant, unconventional. But on January 17th, 1920, America's most wide-open city ran head-on into America's most puritanical law, Prohibition.
San Franciscans, it must be said, were extremely hostile to Prohibition. San Francisco, as most people know, had a reputation for being the sort of emporium of vice on the West Coast, going back to the gold rush days. And vice in San Francisco was always fueled by massive quantities of alcohol.
Historically, San Francisco had more bars per capita than any other city in America. So when the nation went dry, liquor simply went underground. San Francisco remained the wettest city in the West. Prohibition was so unpopular in San Francisco that in 1926, the city's Board of Supervisors actually passed a resolution opposing the use of any local police to enforce the 18th Amendment. That task fell to a new breed of federal agent, the Prohibition Officer, or Prohi.
We were the dirty guys of the generation. Our pictures were shown in the newspaper in cartoons, always with long faces and long hats.
Keith Loomis started out in the Border Patrol, but he left to become a Prohi because he was looking for more action. He found it, often working undercover or in disguise in a territory that stretched all the way from San Jose to Crescent City.
It was impossible to enforce it. There were a very limited number of agents. Heaven knows how many places they were that were selling liquor. But it was certainly over 100 to 1.
Logistics were only part of the problem in San Francisco. There was also the issue of demographics. The Prohibition movement came out of the Midwest, fostered primarily by native-born small-town Protestants. San Francisco was a big city full of immigrant Catholics and Jews. In 1920, almost two-thirds of the city's residents were either foreign-born or had at least one immigrant parent.
The Italians, the Germans, the Irish, all three of these groups had arrived in America with a long-standing tradition of ritual and recreational drinking. And to suggest to them that they should give up this part of their culture struck them as ludicrous.
Se sei orgoglioso, non dove tu vieni, saprai sempre dove tu vai. If you're proud of where you come from, you'll always know where you're going, and you'll take pride in everything you do.
Dante Benedetti was born in North Beach, the city's oldest Italian neighborhood. In the 20s, there were as many speakeasies here as anywhere in the city. For places like the Gold Spike, which was a candy store until Prohibition, the elegant Fior d'Italia, and the new Pisa restaurant run by Dante's family, Prohibition was little more than a minor inconvenience.
My father was arrested, 14 times? you know, for bootlegging. So he didn't get away without getting arrested. But you kind of got lightweight sentences, you know.
I don't think by any stretch of the imagination are these people considered to be hardened criminals. Some people might consider them to be public servants.
Coastal fog, night and mornings. San Francisco's most familiar forecast was music to the ears of bootleggers and rum runners from Monterey to Mendocino. The fog provided cover for an armada of ships which sat just outside U.S. territorial waters and brought an endless supply of liquor from Canada. With 800 miles of coastline and countless coves and sheltered inlets to choose from, California was a rum runner's delight.
The residents of San Francisco became acquainted with these rum ships. Local newspapers would print stories about when these ships were back in the vicinity, and San Franciscans, of course, would very much look forward to what these ships were bringing down.
They were bringing down as much as 70,000 cases of liquor at a time. Half Moon Bay was a favorite port of entry for San Francisco's hooch. Roadhouses sprouted up along the coast, places like Frank's, now the distillery in Moss Beach, which was so close to the rum runners' landing spots that the inventory was simply carried up the hill. Up in San Francisco, the Coast Guard formed an anti-booze navy in 1924 to stem the illegal flow of liquor. But the new force met with limited success. One night, a San Francisco Coast Guard cutter fired on a suspected rum runner, only to discover that the target was a boat belonging to the Army Corps of Engineers. Prohibition has been called the noble experiment, but like many experiments, it failed, especially in cosmopolitan cities like San Francisco. In fact, the 18th Amendment made lawbreakers out of thousands of previously law-abiding citizens. More significantly, because of Prohibition, crime got organized. The loudest roar of the Roaring '20s was the sound of a new kind of violence that shattered American cities. The mayhem of the mob. Prohibition begat the mob, and the mob soon infiltrated almost every aspect of American vice. But in San Francisco, as usual, things were a little different.
San Francisco during the 1920s did not have the gangster element like Chicago and New York. There was a general feeling in San Francisco that vice should be homegrown, that vice in San Francisco belonged to the locals.
In an increasingly lawless age, San Francisco remained relatively peaceful, in part because there was an understanding between the San Francisco police and locals.
The rule was you can do what you want to do as long as there's no rough stuff. Between 1928 and 1932, 4 years, there were 6 gangland slayings in San Francisco. I mean, they had that many in Chicago in a week. Now, I know Chicago is much larger than San Francisco, but it's not 50 times larger.
Not only was San Francisco a smaller city and therefore easier to police, it was also geographically isolated. In the 20s, there weren't any bridges, so police could keep a closer watch on who came into town.
There was a special group of police detectives assigned to the points of entry of San Francisco, primarily the train station and the ferry building. These detectives were to look for criminals and undesirables coming into town. If they were a criminal and they were wanted, they were immediately arrested. If they were just undesirable, they were told in no uncertain terms, under the threat of being arrested for vagrancy, to get out of town.
There's even a story, and it may be apocryphal, that Al Capone was considering expanding into San Francisco and found that local vice was just too tightly controlled in San Francisco, and that there was no way that an outsider like him, even like Al Capone, would be able to break his way into the city.
Of course, Big Al did eventually realize his dream of living in San Francisco. He was among the first prisoners taken to Alcatraz in 1934 after it became a federal penitentiary. Ironically, even though San Francisco didn't become a city of gangsters, it was the site of one of the most notorious crime stories of the decade, the sensational trial of Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle.
When we return to San Francisco in the 20s, a Hollywood scandal that rocked the city and the nation.
We now return to Cron 4 presents San Francisco in the 20s.
In the 1920s, San Francisco was the most sophisticated city in the West. So the newly minted stars of Hollywood loved to hop on a train called the Lark and come up to the city for weekend getaways. Stars like Fatty Arbuckle, the most popular and highest paid movie comedian this side of Charlie Chaplin. He came to San Francisco with a bunch of his pals to celebrate the Labor Day weekend in 1921. They took over 3 suites at the St. Francis Hotel, broke out the bathtub gin, and began to party. But the festivities ended abruptly when a young starlet and model named Virginia Rapp was found writhing in pain on the floor of Arbuckle's bathroom. When she died a few days later, Arbuckle was arrested for murder.
Well, I think Fatty Arbuckle represented Hollywood, and he represented the physical and gargantuan excesses of Hollywood in both his person and his alleged behavior.
Those excesses were particularly deplorable to the nation's women who had gotten the right to vote in 1920 with passage of the 19th Amendment. But California's women had been voting since 1911, and in San Francisco, their political clout had been instrumental in shutting down the notorious Barbary Coast.
And the efforts were being made at the time of the Arbuckle case to sort of really clean up this prostitution culture and this sort of freewheeling red light culture. And so Arbuckle walked into a situation where he represented a sort of incarnate principle of sexual license, which the people, for other reasons and in other ways, were trying to suppress.
When Arbuckle was finally brought to trial on charges of manslaughter, the public was transfixed. Day after day, readers were titillated by the lurid allegations of sordid behavior reported in sensational and sometimes embroidered detail by the press. Though the first trial ended in a hung jury, San Francisco DA Matthew Brady didn't hesitate to go after Arbuckle again. Arbuckle's defense team hired a young detective and fledgling writer named Dashiell Hammett. His experiences investigating the seamier side of life in San Francisco would inspire him to create a whole new literary genre, the hard-boiled detective novel. Arbuckle was tried not once, not twice, but 3 times before finally being acquitted. It soon became clear, however, that the fat man had been found guilty in the court of public opinion. Innocent or not, Fatty Arbuckle's career was over. Despite the notoriety of the Arbuckle case, San Francisco and Hollywood maintained a mutual admiration society that would last throughout the 1920s. From blue bloods to blue collars, it seemed that San Franciscans couldn't get enough of the movies. And the city also served as the backdrop for a number of their favorite films. In 1923, when Cecil B. DeMille conceived his first version of the 10 Commandments, he chose St. Peter and Paul's Church, still under construction, for the contemporary scenes in the film. And to the great delight of the women of the city, Rudolph Valentino, the Sheik himself, came to the Embarcadero to film a waterfront epic about a Shanghai sailor called Moran of the Lady Letty. Film productions came and went, but going to the movies became a way of life for San Franciscans. And in those days, going to the movies was an event.
They always had a stage show or dancers or somebody featured, and then you'd have your movies. It used to be great to go downtown to the theater, as you call it.
In the 20s, a series of spectacular movie palaces were built up and down Market Street. Theaters designed to be not only showcases for a growing industry, but destinations in themselves. Places like the Fox, the Orpheum, and the Warfield. For most of the decade, the movies were, of course, silent, but that changed with the arrival of Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer. Filmed partly in San Francisco at Coffee Dan's, a unique club restaurant on O'Farrell at Powell, The Jazz Singer changed movies forever.
The Embassy Theater brought the first talking pictures into San Francisco in 1928. And the first real talking picture, I saw it. It was Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer.
Will you give me something?
But that was an amazing thing, talking pictures.
Shut your eyes, Mama. Shut them for little Jackie. Oh, I'm going to steal something.
Perhaps even more amazing was a new invention so exciting that it soon began to rival the movies as San Francisco's favorite form of entertainment: radio.
It was just like a miracle. You just fool around with a few wires and you're able to get this sound, and it was a miracle, really, to listen to, I think.
In the Bay Area, the miracle of radio began even before the country's first licensed broadcast in 1920. All the way back in 1912, Dr. Charles Harold was doing what he called radio casts every Wednesday night from his engineering trade school in San Jose. Harold's wife, Sybil, was undoubtedly the country's first female disc jockey.
Our first baby boy was born, and we have a picture of him where I'm holding him up to the transmitter, and we wanted to see if that baby's cry could be transmitted to the Fairmont Hotel.
In 1922, San Francisco got its first licensed radio stations. Among them was KPO, known today as KNBR, which broadcast from the Hale Brothers department store at 5th and Market. By 1925, there were more than a dozen Bay Area stations, and they transformed the city. You could hear the San Francisco Opera in your living room. You could even listen to a play-by-play description of the World Series. Unless, of course, you were down at Rec Park rooting for the most popular baseball team in the city's history, the San Francisco Seals.
In the 1920s, the Seals were incredibly successful. In fact, it was really the glory years, I think, of San Francisco baseball. The Seals in the 1920s won 4 Pacific Coast League titles. Their attendance level was at record highs. Even one season in which they came in last place, they still had the highest attendance of any team in the league. So they really had a huge fan following.
One reason was the Seals' little bandbox of a ballpark built in 1907 at the corner of 15th and Valencia. Rec Park had several unique features, the most notorious of which was a pre-Prohibition institution known as the Booze Cage. During Prohibition, they quit selling beer and whiskey, so everybody just brought their own.
Fans could pay 75 cents admission, and included with the price of the ticket was their choice of either a ham and cheese sandwich, a shot of whiskey, or 2 beers. And needless to say, it wasn't called the ham and cheese sandwich cage.
But without a doubt, the main draw at Rec Park was the players. Throughout the 20s and beyond, the Seals were always well stocked with homegrown talent. Guys like Gus Seward, Smead Jolly, and the greatest Seal of them all, Francis J. Lefty O'Doul.
Lefty was the #1 hero of San Francisco baseball, not only because he was great as a player, he led the National League in hitting and everything else, but he was a local boy from Butchertown.
During the 1927 season, his greatest with the team, the Seals held a day in Lefty's honor. They say it was one of the biggest crowds the park ever drew. Lefty remained a beloved figure in San Francisco through his short but brilliant major league career, and then as the Seals' longtime manager. In fact, the epitaph on his tombstone could be applied to almost anyone who lived in San Francisco in the 20s. He was here at a good time and had a good time while he was here.
When we return to San Francisco in the 20s, the movers and shakers who defined the decade and shaped the city.
We now return to Cron 4 Presents San Francisco in the 20s.
There may have been no American city that was better suited to the mood of the 20s than San Francisco. Optimistic, hedonistic, and more than a little flamboyant. The city and the decade were made for each other. And there was one man who, more than any other, personified San Francisco's style in the 20s, Mayor James R. Sonny Jim Rolfe.
Ralph apparently fit the city's image of itself perfectly. He was a ship owner. That means he had the sea in his blood. He was a capitalist. He was, at that time, a Republican, considered good stuff by the people then. He wore cowboy boots. He wore a flower in his lapel. He had a little mustache, looked like a toothbrush.
During his first term in office, Rolfe was a dynamo, personally involved in almost every aspect of civic life. But by the 20s, a succession of political, financial, and health problems combined to change Rolfe's leadership style. He began to function more as a figurehead than an administrator. He didn't so much run the city as preside over it.
Whenever there was something to be opened, whether it was a building or a road or a trolley car line, he was there to cut the ribbon and to glad hand with the people of that particular neighborhood. So people really felt like they knew him and that he was their mayor.
As the 20s unfolded, Rolfe was elected to an unprecedented third and then fourth and then fifth term, reflecting his popularity with virtually every segment of the city's population.
Sonny Jim Rolfe, just through sheer force of personality, projected a sense of well-being and unity that perhaps was not truly there, or at least there to the degree that Rolfe made everybody believe it was there. It was his job as mayor, as he conceived it, to make everyone belong, to heal those social divisions, which I think he understood were severely grinding beneath the surface of San Francisco like tectonic plates that could yield to an earthquake.
The rumblings underneath the city's crust during the 20s came primarily from the suppression of organized labor. A newly formed group called the Industrial Association dominated labor relations in San Francisco throughout the decade. Its membership read like a who's who of the city's business and civic elite.
The Industrial Association of San Francisco was perhaps the most successful anti-union organization in the country. It had support from the banks, from the railroads, the insurance companies, the major manufacturing companies, the shipping companies. Every company almost that was involved in a significant way in the economy of San Francisco was a contributor to the Industrial Association. They saw the suppression of unions as being in the best interests of the city.
Those interests would be served until 1934, when the convulsive general strike would finally begin to break the Industrial Association's power over organized labor. One of the reasons the Industrial Association was so successful was the simple fact that in the 20s, working men and women didn't really have all that much to complain about. Almost everybody was getting a piece of the pie.
This was a very prosperous city for working people. They attained a quality of life. They had availability of municipal swimming pools, even municipal golf courses begun to come into the city, municipal tennis courts. These are unprecedented public amenities in the city which make their appearance in the 1920s.
The city flowered in other ways during this decade of almost unprecedented prosperity. Many of the cultural institutions and landmarks that still grace the city were born in the 20s. The San Francisco Opera was formed thanks to a visionary young Neapolitan conductor named Gaetano Merola. The company's first season in 1922 was held at the Stanford Football Stadium, of all places, because Merola was impressed by the acoustics. For the rest of the 20s, performances were held primarily at the Civic Auditorium. Then in 1927, San Franciscans passed a bond issue to build the magnificent War Memorial Opera House, completed in 1932. In Golden Gate Park, the central section and tower were added to the de Young Museum in 1921. And thanks to a $250,000 bequest from Ignaz Steinhardt and his brother Sigmund, a world-class aquarium was opened in 1923. 233,000 people visited in the first month alone.
I think the 19-teens defined the physical shape of the city, the streets, the squares, the public places. The 1920s filled in those spaces with grand architecture. You can't find a surviving building in San Francisco from the 1920s that's not a distinguished building. It just was an unerring hit after hit architecturally.
High on a hill overlooking Land's End, a particularly architectural icon was taking shape. It was a gift to the city from a singular woman with a singular idea of San Francisco, Alma Spreckels.
Alma was an enigma to San Francisco society. She had the looks, she was very patrician, she was 6 feet tall, she certainly had the money after she married A.B. Spreckels, but she was a kind of take me as I am or don't take me at all kind of person.
San Francisco had often been called the Paris of the Pacific, a comparison Alma wanted taken literally. Her museum, the Palace of the Legion of Honor, was meant to bring a major infusion of French culture to the city, including the largest collection of Rodin sculptures in the country at the time. She also made sure every French dignitary who passed through the city paid a visit to her masterpiece in the making. When it was finally ready, Alma's gift to the city was unquestionably a brilliant success.
Nothing like this had ever happened in San Francisco before. Of course society turned out for it. They wouldn't miss it. The Chronicle wrote afterwards that it was the most impressive display of artists and people of wealth ever in San Francisco. So it was a triumph for Alma. It really was.
San Francisco was coming of age. Its new architectural treasures mirrored the city's growing sense of its own significance. The future felt limitless. It was time to expand, to grow, to achieve the full promise of a great metropolis.
When we return to San Francisco in the 20s, growth, good times, and golden opportunities, but not for everyone.
July 1924, and over San Francisco, the first transcontinental airmail reaches its destination.
Like the rest of America in the 20s, San Francisco's imagination had been captured by those daring young men in their flying machines. Of course, the most daring of all was Charles Lindbergh. In September 1927, only 4 months after his historic transatlantic flight, Lucky Lindy landed his Spirit of St. Louis at San Francisco's brand new municipal airport, Mills Field, now the site of San Francisco International Airport. The city, of course, gave him a hero's welcome. It was as though the aviation rage was a part of the city's insatiable appetite for growth. During the 20s, it wasn't enough for the city just to spread out. It had to go higher as well.
It was a time of tremendous optimism. It was a time of building things. It was a time when the city developed into very much what it looks like now. I mean, you could see, if you live on the bay, on a ferry boat in 1927, 28, you could look at the city and you'd see a recognizable San Francisco.
There were some large office buildings constructed in downtown San Francisco, the Pacific Telephone Building, the Russ Building, which in some ways dominated the skyline until fairly recent years.
As the city's skyline shot upward, so did its population, from slightly over 500,000 in 1920 to well over 600,000 by the end of the decade. To keep pace with the city's growth, civic leaders had already set in motion two key components of expansion: transportation and water. In 1923, the massive O'Shaughnessy Dam, the centerpiece of the city's Hetch Hetchy water project, was completed. Aggressive expansion of the city's municipal railroad system, including the construction of several new tunnels, was already well underway. And where the railway went, new neighborhoods followed.
They had to build a municipal streetcar line, which you considered daring in those days, out to the Sunset of Richmond, out to the ocean view. Nothing was out there but jackrabbits and sand dunes.
San Francisco's new neighborhoods were soon filled by thousands of first-time homebuyers. And in the garages beneath their tidy stucco bungalows, they parked their first cars, bought from the dozens of new dealerships on Auto Row, otherwise known as Van Ness Avenue. By decade's end, you could take your car for a Sunday drive on the newly opened Bayshore Freeway or drive through Golden Gate Park until you reached the widest thoroughfare in the West.
They built the Great Highway then, too. What a great name for something, the Great Highway.
Not far from the Great Highway, one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods was being built. The elegant Seacliff development represented both the best and the worst of an expansive decade.
San Francisco in the 20s was an expanding and growing place for most people, but there were exceptions.
Those exceptions were the city's minorities. According to the 1920 census, an estimated 2,400 Negroes, 3,900 Mexicans, and 13,000 Chinese and Japanese were living in San Francisco at the time. For them, it was a very different city.
The thing was that California had a long history of discrimination, particularly against Asians. These folks were excluded from the civic life of San Francisco. There were 11 supervisors, all white men. There were, all the city officials in the Civic Hall were all white. Their idea of a minority at that time was an Italian guy, I think.
San Francisco, historically, was definitely the hotbed for anti-Asian sentiment. Every single initiative seems to have come out of San Francisco, whether it be against the Chinese first, against the Japanese.
San Francisco's political leaders had long ago solved what they called the Chinese problem through repressive legislation. Then in the early 1900s, they perceived a new threat, the Japanese who had come to San Francisco by the thousands. Many had moved on to work in agriculture throughout California. But when they started turning land that nobody else wanted into profitable small farms, it was time to write some new rules. California's alien land laws, passed in the teens and 1920s, said that if you couldn't become an American citizen, and all Asian immigrants could not, then you couldn't own property.
Obviously, it had a tremendous impact. America is a capitalist democracy. How do you function under capitalism without the property right, which is so fundamental?
The alien land laws were devastating, but the lawmakers weren't through yet. The U.S. Congress struck the most damaging blow with the National Origins Act of 1924, which barred immigration by anyone who would not be eligible for citizenship, effectively ending Asian immigration until World War II. And a little-known statute called the Cable Act of 1922 blended racism and sexism in a pernicious attack on interracial marriage. A 1907 federal law said that if an American woman married an immigrant, she would lose her U.S. citizenship. The Cable Act modified that law so that it only applied to a woman who married a man not eligible for citizenship. In other words, an Asian man, like Gunjiro Aoki.
My grand-uncle Gunjiro, this handsome, dashing samurai, came to San Francisco and fell in love with Miss Helen Gladys Emery, this beautiful, genteel young woman with light brown hair and green eyes, who was the daughter of the Archdeacon of Grace Cathedral.
Helen Emery's family was not only prominent in the city, they could trace their roots all the way back to the Mayflower.
So you really couldn't get more American than that. But marrying a Japanese, she lost her citizenship.
The press had a field day with the marriage story, making life exceedingly difficult for the newlyweds.
They found they were pariahs. They had no place to live. They couldn't live in the Caucasian community because of him. They couldn't live in the Japanese community because of her. Their children were branded as misfits, monsters.
But the Aokis stayed together until Gunjiro's death in 1932. Helen Emery was then allowed to be an American again. Her citizenship was restored. Sadly for the Asian populations of San Francisco, the Roaring '20s were distinctly muted. For them, instead of good times and galloping prosperity, the '20s were a time of rampant racism and exclusion, and a harbinger of greater injustices to come.
When we return to San Francisco in the 20s, the city's decade of prosperity comes crashing to an end.
Imagine an autumn morning, late October 1929. On the radio in the parlor of your new Sunset bungalow, there are now dozens of stations to choose from. Out on the bay, ferries crisscross in every direction, bringing commuters from city to city and shore to shore. Mayor Rolfe has announced that he'll run for governor next year. And a man named Joseph Strauss, who's either a madman or a visionary, is going to build a suspension bridge across the Golden Gate. There are plans to build a bridge to the East Bay as well. Downtown is still going strong. A spectacular new medical office building just opened at 450 Sutter, and the new Shell building is taking shape down on Bush Street. Out in the avenues, ordinary folks are living the good life, thanks in no small measure to an innovation that everyone's embraced called consumer credit. There are a few doomsdayers who say this boom economy can't last. But if that were true, they wouldn't be moving the stock exchange into handsome new quarters down on Pine Street. All in all, it's a great time for a great city. And then came October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday.
In history's worst panic, over 16 million shares are dumped on the market. Over $14 billion go with them, and so goes the confidence of a nation. Wall Street lays an egg, and so do the 20s.
On the day of the crash, Vera Taylor was working at a brokerage firm in the Rust Building on Montgomery Street. Nearly 70 years later, she remembers the scene vividly.
I remember this little old lady sitting there, you know. She was all dressed in black, and the tears were just streaming down her face. Her eyes were glued to the board. They would put in the prices, you know, and they were constantly changing them. It was just a sight to see. Well, they were bearing their souls is what it really amounted to, you know, because they were seeing all their worldly goods just being drained away.
San Francisco had this kind of big, long, giant, fun, upbeat party pretty much all through the 20s for most of the people.
After the stock market crash in 1929 and the growing realization of what this meant, the decline in manufacturing and unemployment, it suddenly became clear that that 10-year-long party was over.
San Francisco was no more prepared for the crash of 1929 than any other place in America. Fortunes disappeared, people lost everything, families were wiped out here just like everywhere else in the country. But remarkably, when you ask people what they remember most about San Francisco in the 1920s, you'll rarely hear about the crash.
It was a happy time, you know, in San Francisco in those days, I think. They had parades about every day that you went down and stood along Market Street to see these parades, and everybody was in such a good mood to see that.
I sensed there was a feeling of community. There was a great deal of civic pride.
If I had a choice, I would certainly like to live under those conditions rather than the conditions where they have iron bars on the window now and you hardly talk to your neighbors.
There was a real family atmosphere here in San Francisco, and certainly a feeling of optimism and growth, and feeling like, yes, we are the major city on the West Coast. You know, we are the place to be, and it was.
It's been said that the 20s were the last decade of the Age of Innocence, but it was also a coming of age for America's most perpetually rambunctious city. In 10 short years, San Francisco had filled out, assuming much of the shape and size of the place we know today. Many of its current neighborhoods were born in the 20s. So were its cultural landmarks, its architectural jewels, its grand skyscrapers and great highways. The sweep and scale and audacious splendor of a spectacular city coming into its own. That was San Francisco in the 20s, with its style, its swagger, and its idiosyncrasies all intact. San Francisco had arrived.